테스트.
누르고
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the grand finals of YTN and HUFS English Debating Championship. I would like to congratulate both teams for making it so far into the tournament. On site government, we have Team Salient Scoobies. And on site opposition, we have Team Peanut Butter and Jen. I'm Kevin. I have the incredible honor of chairing this round. Judging alongside me is an incredibly esteemed panel, and I will get them to introduce themselves starting from my left.
Hi, I'm Rarata. All the best.
Hi, I'm Camilla. Good luck for the round.
Hi, I'm Dylan. Good luck.
Raymond, good luck.
Hi, I'm Kimun. Wish of luck. Hi, Singchano. Good luck.
Hello, I'm Tae. Good luck.
Hello, I'm Labi. Congratulations and good luck.
Before we get started, just some gentle reminders for the audience. Because we have quite a large audience, please remember not to speak during the speeches to avoid disrupting the speakers. Please ensure that your phones are on silent, and please avoid moving around during speeches. If you have to leave the auditorium, please wait until a speech is over for you to exit the auditorium. With that, I would like to now welcome the Prime Minister to open this grand finals.
Right. Okay.
I think the most important thing for modern day humans, especially in an increasingly individualistic world, is the ability and to have a tightly knit community that you can reach out to whenever you need help. First, let's set up. What do these communities oftentimes look like? I think that it mainly looks like three main things. A, that oftentimes these communities have incredibly strong senses of communal values, but obviously this does not mean that we ignore things like individuals' preferences, but it's that we merely seek to encapsulate the major group goals within the community itself. But B, that as a preemptive, obviously you aren't likely to get coerced or disenfranchised insofar as the motion gives us leeway to assume that it's not that extreme to an extent. But C, so it's not likely for it to be extreme. For instance, this implies that even when you do have doubts about the religion that you're in, they try to touch upon the words of God as well. But what you have to note is that because it's not extreme, obviously other alternative avenues do indeed exist under prop as well. There's mainly two arguments that I want to talk about within my speech. First of all, about why these communal structures are likely to be directly better for the individual, but secondly about how we're able to provide a better sense of fulfillment and a better sense of guidance. Let's talk about the first argument. I think that the problem within the status quo is mainly threefold. A, that the status quo is massively hyper-competitive, where mass amounts of individuals are suffering from a loss of things like community. Note, the very premise of things like chronic stress, the very premise of things like burnout and massive loneliness is that you face difficulty in being in a community and you have no one that you can be yourself to as well. But note, even empirically, that just multitude of countries and multiple institutions continue to show higher and higher rates of things like isolation within status quo. I'll take you later. B, this isolation is likely to be exacerbated within secular societies. Obviously, because it's likely to be comparatively difficult to be able to find individuals with similar values insofar as there are no expectations associated with things like community building as well. But C, I think that these communities are likely to be capitalist to a degree. Why is this so? Not only is it based on your individualistic standards, but it's also that the expectation within these secular societies is also for you to remain selfish and selfish to a degree that you have to that you structurally aren't necessarily communal simply because there's again no binding factor that exists. The conclusion of this analysis is that you're expected to fight without any support and that if you structurally cannot fight against that, it's also structurally on you. Second, why is it likely to be structurally better on-site prop? I think that there's mainly three reasons why. I'll take you later. Obviously that a community, especially a religious one, is literally capable of being a safety net, that they oftentimes care about you unconditionally. So whenever you are in need of real support, or when you require even the extent of things like financial assets under prop, they are probably more likely to be more willing to reach out and to help these individuals as well. But two, that the characterization that you probably have to note is that these are likely to be incredibly tightly knitted communities where the success of one is the success of the other. Thus, even if you do things like make mistakes, they probably grieve with you. And if you do succeed, they also do things like celebrate with you. I think this is especially necessary in the modern world where literally others celebrate for your loss within the status quo. Third, that it's probably easier for you to be able to open up and to be your true self insofar as principally these are people that trust you and that you also directly trust them back. Why is this a fundamentally unique benefit that we're only able to push on-site proposition? There's two reasons why. A, that having someone that you can be yourself to is good, but when you have a literal community, it's probably even better to the extent. But B, that a chance to lower your stress and to actually a chance to allow individuals to vent out your anger and to do things that actually find individuals that you can connect to is probably a unique benefit that only side government is able to provide. Before I move on, I'll take that point.
Can you prove to us why it is impossible to develop a sense of society or belonging with people who have similar interests or identities as you?
Right. I'm also going to talk about that within my second argument as well. Second argument, we're likely to have a better sense of fulfillment and guidance. The first question that I want to ask within this argument is simple. Why do religions provide better senses of meaning and better senses of guidance? A, that religious philosophies oftentimes provide large senses of guidance within ethics. For instance, your way of life. For instance, how you answer things like uncertainty and whatnot. This is likely to be comparatively better than slight opposition insofar as the limits to like the relationships that you probably had are superficial to the extent insofar as their society is likely to be expected to be individualistic to an extent as well. But I think that even more, this is likely to be better than a secular society that does things like emphasize diverse options and diverse optionality because obviously individuals are likely to be stuck with large amounts of uncertainty. That is to say, that slight opposition's world is a world where individuals are forced to come to make conclusions under whatever premise that they are under as well. But B, that what I think happens is that religion often operates under nearly unconditional beliefs. But I think comparatively, opposition's myth of things like autonomous decision making that they're also probably going to talk about is structurally inaccessible insofar as there's two reasons why. One is that many of the life decisions that you make feel meaningless because there's no actual greater purpose that is associated with whatever life decision that you're trying to make. But second, that it's capitalistic. So probably your senses of purpose are cutthroat. So you make money within the metric of, so you probably like make things like money like the actual metric of success that you have to like judge then your life upon as well. Notes, comparatively, what religions are directly able to do for the individual is that we're actually able to emphasize your inherent value of you being God's child, that God is accepting about whoever you are as an individual. But see, that actually tells you that even if you make mistakes, you do indeed have a place to to seek guidance and hope. So it probably also gives you emotional stability to the degree, as you're probably not burdened by the failures that you have, because the narrative of religion is that God can help you actually overcome your worries and your difficulties as well. I think this is uniquely what religion is darkly able to provide for you, because not only does it actually incite hope within you, but it actually does things like provide fulfillment. The extent is, when you feel accepted and when you feel darkly trusted by your community, you're probably likely to be able to self-actualize because you trust yourself as well. And I think that this is probably the most important metric that you have to buy within this debate.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and I welcome the leader of opposition.
Thank you. The right to freely choose your religion because you are not surrounded by people who will judge you for every spiritual decision you make is the most important benefit of this debate. We protect the most vulnerable people, especially in communities where it's so easy for them to be ostracized, left out, just because they were born into a family that is not a part of the dominant religion in a community so proud to oppose. I'm going to start my speech with 3 main layers of setup then, but firstly, with some framing. And I'm going to clarify 2 things here. To begin with, on religions, right? Different belief systems teach different ways of life and values. Christianity values humanity and commitment to God, accepting the good news of Jesus Christ as your savior. Taoism respects nature. Confucianism prioritizes, having respect for elders and your community. But second, well, that is to say that all religions have different worldviews on what the ideal world is. But second, on the timing for humans to choose faith, right? As much as children are malleable to the exposure of different religions from a young age, the time you select or change your faith actually does not matter. There are so many instances of individuals becoming Christian or perhaps changing their religion later on in life after discovering the world for themselves. We will tell you that's an exclusive benefit you have on our side, where it's secular, where honestly nobody really cares whether you're religious or not. You actually have the leeway to explore for yourself. Second part of setup, what should this debate look like? Prop has to defend a world, or Prop's world is one where you're born into a community with a dominant belief, and you may or may not be born into a family with that religion too. On op, our world is a secular community where generally people are atheist or agnostic, but just generally don't care what you believe, and I'm going to prove why that's true later on in my arguments. I want to clarify it's not only a debate about Christianity or extremely inclusive religions, right? It's not like in their world, you might end up being born in an atheist family in a mostly Christian village all the time, and they'll be very nice and accept you. So Prop has the burden to prove, even if you're born to a Shia Muslim parents in a Sunni Muslim community, sure, it may be improbable and it may be kind of extreme, but the weight of that itself is significant enough for them to have to defend. And thirdly, what is the main metric to winning this debate? And I think it's on autonomy. Are people, on which side are people actually able to choose for themselves, realize which religion actually matches with their worldview, and have that sense of freedom? Before moving on to my arguments, onto some responses then. First, I want to point out that the prevalence of the religion is determined by the motion, but the extremity of the teachings of the religion itself is not given by the motion. I'll explain why that's important in my first argument. But on their main path to victory, which is their idea about the sense of community, few responses here. Firstly, it's unclear why community does not occur in our secular world. If people do not bond over religion, then obviously they bond over other things. Because people, naturally humans would probably value community to some extent, which means whether that's the same interests or hobbies or passions, there are still other ways for people to form their own bonds and fairly close communities. It's unclear why religion has to be the only way. And of course, they talk about fulfillment and why religion is especially more fulfilling in terms of you have a sense of morality that you have. I'll explain why we can have that on our world in second argument. But second, on the notion of this being like a lonely epidemic or whatever, it's just untrue. Things like social media and abundance of platforms for you to build relationships with new people exist on our side too. Therefore, it's untrue that the secular world makes people actively individualistic and selfish. With that cleared up, onto our arguments then. First argument about the harms of being born into a largely religious society. And there are 2 parts of this argument based on possible scenarios in their side. First, let's say you are born into a family that does practice the dominant religion. Sure, that seems good, but that's actually indoctrination. You're forced into a religion because everyone around you practices it. Most people tell you have to follow this. Everyone, every day is a constant reminder that if you don't follow this religion, you go to hell, or you are eternally punished. You have no choice of changing it because you're going to be judged. Sometimes you aren't even aware of the other, various other religions that exist out there. But why is that significant? Because some religions are extreme or demand acts of service to a deity that actually limit your autonomy to great extents. For example, things like mission trips or camps or forms of mandatory service that people believe are you have to do these in order to go to heaven. You have to do these in order to earn favor from a certain God. These things are very much true, and there are even some radical religions that even practice forms of self-harm to show loyalty to a God. These things, some of them are radical, some of them are extreme, but the fact that they do exist and that's a possibility on their world means they have to defend that. But second scenario, you choose not to believe in that dominant religion. So why can't this happen? Some people just have the propensity to find it extremely hard to believe in some religions. Some people are just inherently very skeptical. They think, they just doubt the religion even if they're born in a community that highly practices it, or they're born into a family that doesn't practice that. Or you might just have trauma with the religion itself. Whatever way it is, if you lose your faith and are a minority in the largely religious community, your life is done for in this community for two reasons. Firstly, religious incentive is to be inclusive. So people are going to ask you why you left the faith, why you chose to do this when now you're going to go to hell and now you're going to go to hell and you're not going to be able to get into heaven. These are all intrusive questions that actively just infringe on your autonomy and your freedom to just choose whatever religion you have. But second, because religion is often connected to being seen as a very good person. And that's obviously bad for people who don't believe in religion, for people who believe in a minority of religion, and the way that other people perceive you. On to our second argument, why it is preferable to live in a secular world. And there are two questions to ask here. Firstly, what does this look like? Being secular, a secular community is usually not exclusive of religious people. While it's true that religious people always try to earn followers, it's not true that secular people always try to get more people to lose their religion and become secular too. But why is that significant? And I have two reasons. Firstly, because that gives you the autonomy to choose your own faith. You can take time, you can explore, you can live, you can be free to see which worldviews and which religion actually aligns with what you believe. And the thing here is that nobody will judge you, because obviously there will be a few other believers out there. It's not like everybody in our world is all atheists, as obviously the motion implies predominantly. But second, there are many ways to live a good moral life without religion. And I think this greatly clashes with their idea that religion is the only way for you to find fulfillment, to have a good moral compass, and whatnot. I would tell you that many philosophies, for instance, exist to live by. Confucianism, these things are not religions, but they're just basic principles that you choose to follow. You can choose to follow certain Taoist principles or Confucianist principles. It all depends on you, but that doesn't mean that you follow a certain predominant narrative in a society. But even if you don't have the interest in actively seeking out a form of morality, your idea of what is right and is wrong is established as you grow up, as you observe, and as you experience the community around you. We protect the most vulnerable people in this debate. We allow people to choose what religion they want, because that should never be controlled in the first place. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay. Can I start? The best form of fulfillment is spiritual religious fulfillment, because it tells you that even if you may not be the richest, even if you may not be the most powerful, your life is still dictated by a philosophy that is greater in definition than inferior practicalities. It gives you a strong sense of self-belief that your values, your community, your character, and what you believe is reflective of things like eternal salvation. We think this idea of meaning cannot be replicated in an individualistic secular world where there are other external priorities that prevent people from opting into this higher elevation of identity opposition fails to respond to. There are two issues in this debate. First is on fulfillment, and second is on why optionality leads to more indecision and decision paralysis. Let's first talk about fulfillment. First, we don't understand what leader of opposition is saying, because it does matter where you learn your religion and when you learn it. We think when you are young, you are much more malleable and gullible because you do not have things like life experiences. When you are old, you have things like pre-existing beliefs and other priorities and other commitments that prevent you from fully opting into the belief in the first place. The impact is, this shows you how effective, no thank you, in terms of time and where these people, when these people learn these religions in the first place in our comparative, why it will be effective at doctrination. But second, to get the maximum amount of religious benefit, we think, if you want to feel like the spiritual awakening, you want to feel like your religious beliefs are worth more than practicalities, you need the kind of long-term doctrination. They can't try to co-opt the benefit of saying oh, people are spiritual
spiritually elevated because they have options. We think this kind of elevation actually requires you to be in these communities for extensive periods of time, to know from a young age that this is something you want. This is why this, I want to clarify, is not a benefit they can co-opt. But I want to address their uncharitable argument, which is that minorities suddenly lose the ability to engage in self-actualization and representation in our world. The first thing I want to clarify, they are very unillustrative about the kinds of minorities they talk about. Let's first talk about minorities whose identities are formed later. You are not necessarily born a feminist. You are not necessarily born with a certain gender orientation. We think when you are indoctrinated from young ages in the first place, we would deny we would deny that there is a high probability you end up like being that kind of minority in the first place. But second, religions actually do have structural incentives to be accommodating and inclusive. What does this look like? First, religious texts actually have different interpretations. We think many religious communities can stay religious and still be inclusive. The trade-off is minimal. For example, they say like, look, God created everyone equally, God loves everyone. These are kinds of open-ended things that we think prevent things like complete isolation. Second, many religious texts actually give specific unique purposes to people, even if they are born as minorities. What does this mean? For example, let's say you're born as a woman in a very conservative society in our absolute worst case. We think these religious texts dictate that your role as a woman is still really important in these secular societies, that your belief is what matters, that your commitments and contributions to this community is weighed extensively. The problem with opposition is that they try to tell you this is not true. No, thank you. But we think oftentimes communities do this. Like they say God created everyone equally, your role matters. This is comparatively better than a secular society where we think actually there are strict definitions of why a role matters, there are strict expectations and high barriers of entries to entering important jobs and important roles, which is why the notion of fulfillment is often inaccessible in most instances. But third, why is this much more worse in secular societies? I think the contextualization they fail to respond to is that actually the binding factor of religion in these religious communities is really binding, it's really effective, which means you are actually likely to be accepted to some extent even if you're a minority. Comparatively, let's discuss what happens when you're born as a minority in these secular societies. We think, regardless of if you're born as a minority or not, there are still standards like you need to fulfill capitalism, you need to fulfill these individualistic norms. It is still much more difficult to find communities when you're born as a minority in these secular places because there simply aren't as other people like you. Comparatively, when you are bound by religious beliefs, even if you are a minority, you are more likely to be accepted. We win on probability of minorities as well. The second thing I want to talk about is a secular world really better? Because their claim is that, oh, you can be free, you can have optionality. But this is just untrue for a few strategic reasons. I think the first thing is the reason why we think this debate is the average individual, right? And the reason why the goal of capitalism is to reach a state of self-content and self-pride is true by earning money. So the point of capitalism was always to ensure people have self-pride, to ensure people have fulfillment. That's literally what their argument is contingent upon. That's why you try to earn money. But the problem is the prerequisite to ensuring that you are self-content requires you to be born in a somewhat high hierarchy. It requires you to have necessary talents to rise the capitalistic ladder. There are high social norms and high social expectations of what it means in which you can be actually proud of the identity you are born in, what it means to have actual fulfillment in these secular societies, because it is dictated by what society thinks, not by what the religious text thinks. But second, the reason why the clear purpose is important, because we think it leads to things like indecision crisis in the status quo. Their benefit is there's optionality, it is worse on their side. Why? First, even if people have multiple options, oftentimes they're not sure what to do. They are overwhelmed by things like more proximate factors in their life. For example, they have jobs, they have external commitments that matter more than deciding what kind of norm they want to follow. But second, we think identity is often next in priority in the sense that these proximate things like their job is more important than finding communities, because this is what society tells them to do. This is why many people, average people, end up in sad middle class jobs working in the office, corporate slaves within these secular societies, because they can't find actual true meaning in what they actually want. So identity, therefore, in their side is a next priority to pre-existing proximate things, which is why things like procrastination occurs. But third, even if you find communities you want, it is difficult to fully opt into these communities to have important effect, to feel like you actually belong. This is because you engage in you test out all these different communities. You join these communities when you're 25, 26. The impact is very different, diametrically different to the kind of fulfillment you would get compared to when you're born in these communities from young ages. This is why we optimize this form of self-fulfillment, self-actualization only in a world when you're born in these religious societies from young ages.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech. I welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello. I'll take she, her pronouns if you need to address me. I'll start at my first word. It is sad that P2 says decision paralysis, by definition having too many choices, is a bad thing. In fact, we would celebrate a secular society where you're exposed to more viewpoints, where in fact you have more decisions, where you're able to actually autonomously choose from the moment you're born into a community, the life you want to lead, the kind of choices you want to make. We do not see a reason why one confound choice, one confound spiritual viewpoint is something that is necessary in order to live a fulfilling life. Before anything, a couple direct responses. First of all, they say these secular communities will be isolating. I think society and forming a community is formed better based on shared interests, shared values, something you can actually opt into and choose and truly care about rather than just going to the same neighborhood church. Just as times change and status quo, it is increasingly easier to find common grounds, to find communities like your sports club, college. Social media allows you to be more connected than anyone ever through the internet, things like dating apps. So when they tell us there's a loneliness epidemic, that is simply false. You are more connected than ever, but rather in a religious community, when you're more strictly bound, that is when you feel more isolated from the rest of the world. Like the innate nature religion operates under is exclusivity, that you're different from the worldly values. That is far more isolated. But thirdly, I want to do a quick weighing. Because there are infinitely unassured characterizations of the person, life, personality, and race that you may be born into under the veil of ignorance, it is a side that maximizes choice that is able to win, and guess what? We probably have more choice. But fourthly, for a proposition to assert that only religious people can be most fulfilled, as they say word by word, is absurd. We tell you that career, hobby, love, friends, art, music, these are all ways you can feel fulfilled. I'll take that later. There are so many vastly opportunities that exist in this world now, especially as we are becoming modernized. Like literally, I think side proposition only sees the world as like the 17th century. But fifthly, they say there's going to be like different and diverse, like more accepting interpretations, which is why gay people will be fine. Sure, good interpretations exist, but one, they're in the minority, which I'll prove in my extension. But two, these do not matter insofar as in the veil of ignorance, the propensity for you to be born into an oppressive society exists. That is a risk you ought not to take. I said I'll take that later. I want to then bring back points of Nayun's speech. Firstly, I want to bring back the impacts of being told all your life that you will go to hell if you are out of the norm. For the people who are just born with innately questioning personality, who are skeptical, who are born as an outcast of the religion, your life just becomes a living hell. You might be SA'd from the pastor. That is actually quite common. You have to hide your sexuality. You are berated for these characteristics that you could not control. Notice, it isn't just the terrible persecution itself that is so harmful to you, but it is the feeling of isolation, a feeling that your community has abandoned you, that I do not belong. That is so detrimental. It does not matter that some people will fit in, insofar as we tell you that you cannot know what kind of personality, sexual orientation, gender, race you are. No feeling of belonging will outweigh the sheer isolation, abandonment, and hopelessness that you are subjugated to under the proposition. But secondly, when we tell you about choice, it is not that you will research into all the philosophies under our side of the house. It is that the amount of information and diverse experiences you will be exposed to under a secular community is just far greater. So from the moment you are born, your autonomy is just far greater. I'll take a point.
Yeah, our unresponded characterization was that people value practicalities in secular societies over finding communities.
When you talk about capitalism, is your society communist, or do you live in the woods? Obviously that exists on your side as well. I do not see why there's necessarily a contention in the debate. I want to move on to my extension then on social progress and inclusion. Under a society where religion is the paradigm, this reinforces passivity because God is your biggest savior. Under our secular comparative, you're more likely to protest, you're likely to hold institutions institutions accountable, the government and your oppressors accountable. Because firstly, the biggest common conception of religion is that bad things happen because God intended to, because most religions, if you'll notice, see God as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all correct. Nayan tells you religion was created to explain and give answers, but when people were starving on the streets, when an all-knowing, all-powerful God is letting this happen, religious communities only have one explanation. They will believe, they deserve it. They deserve to be poor and starving, because there is no other possible explanation to a religious community that is a truth that you believe. But secondly, further, even if that is untrue, religions will, like Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, tell you not to fight back, but rather that your God will serve you justice in the end. This is really dangerous. Religions like Christianity literally tell you that if someone slaps you on the cheek, you should turn your cheek over and let them hit you again. That is just absurd for the starving person. All religions say forgiveness is a virtue. Buddhism says not to care about money or materials, that you should be fine with where you are even if you are poor and failing to make ends meet. All of these were developed and function as a means to pacify the most vulnerable, the poor, the ones who are underprivileged, minorities who are persecuted. They tell them to stay put. That is why Israelites just accepted it and didn't fight back when the Romans attacked them. That is why they just prayed and allowed them to invade them. The problem then is, I don't think you realize how big the impacts are. On our side, you fight back. You realize that, if I'm in a bad situation, there is no God likely, or there are these various interpretations, so I'm unsure. Therefore, it is the government I will hold accountable. The government has failed me. The propensity for society to be more progressive is far greater than on our side, because it is when more oppressed poor people choose to stand up, to rally, to protest, to hold the government accountable instead of praying, because you realize the only person who will save you is you, not God's magic. But also things like the Me Too movement, calling your rapists out, calling out abusers only happens under our side, because on their side they'll just believe, God will punish them, justice will be served in another way, and I don't need to do this. That is literally the mechanism that religion operates under, and we think that is so coercive and so pervasive to the most disadvantaged. And also this is important for a couple of reasons, because one, this is a link to why their society will be more discriminatory, why likely diverse, good, friendly interpretations are less probable. But secondly, it is just far more tangible. These harms are more tangible and quantifiable than the kind of fulfillment that they talk about. That is so abstract. Religion, as Nietzsche says, is the opium of the masses. Under a veil of ignorance, you ought not to choose a world where progress is slow, where if you're in a bad position, your only bet is to just pray for the best, oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and I welcome the government whip.
I will start on my first word. The first thing I'd like to respond to is Ein's characterization that religious people are inherently stupid, that they do not have autonomy within religion because they cannot make choices. The first thing I'd like to contest is that this is untrue, that people try to make autonomous decisions that lead to God's fulfillment, i.e. I try to preserve God's teachings by making decisions that may get me closer to the principles that religions ought to believe. It is untrue that individuals under their side are going to be the only ones who are able to make autonomous decisions. Rather, within the structures that provide certainty, we are the side that gets closer to autonomy, because we are the side that is able to have a sense of guidance and purpose that we're advocating for while getting closer to the actual objectives that we ought to advocate for. I have two clashes in this debate. First, which side is able to maximize self-actualization and fulfillment for the average people? Second, which side is able to minimize suffering of minorities? First, which side is able to maximize self-actualization and fulfillment for average people? I have two reasons why this is the most important clash in the round. Number one, maximizing self-actualization and fulfillment is the very metric in which the very stakeholders that they want to calculate, they want to talk about. No, thank you. The very minorities who are most vulnerable can also gain some form of fulfillment under our side of the house. It is a universal benefit that we're advocating for. But second, on terms of probability, because the likelihood of you being born in as an average individual is probably highest in the round, you ought to buy that maximizing self-actualization in terms of probability and likelihood is the most important. First, what are exclusive means of fulfillment on opposition? There were no illustrations on the exclusivity other than the principle of optionality. We have few reasons why the principle of optionality is not really important. Number one, optionality is important insofar as that optionality leads to good outcomes. The problem we explained to you is that status quo is a world where optionality does not necessarily lead to good outcomes, i.e. there's indecision and there's paralysis over your decisions because you cannot reconfirm or validate whether these decisions even make sense in the first place. But second, let's be charitable. Even if options are a good thing, why do we maximize options better than their world? The first thing we'd like to explain is that the options available under their world are often constrained by capitalistic factors. We explain that a secular society is most likely to be a capitalistic structured world where people people have minimal options, i.e. the way for you to gain self-fulfillment is by maximizing the amount of money, or even if we're charitable and things like hobbies and like things like own values and own preferences exist, the ways in which you get closer to these kinds of fulfillment is through means of money, i.e. you buy your most fun and fulfilling hobbies. But secondly, even if it is not an expensive hobby, we say that way in which you self-actualize under their world are very limited. You get judged for being want to self-actualize in exclusive ways that are not adhering to capitalistic principles. Why are we comparatively better? Our world is a world where individuals are most likely to unconditionally believe that whatever they're advocating for is the most important. They find meaning and fulfillment in the very structures that are already predetermined, which is why you're more likely to find happiness under our world when you're able to meet God's words, God's meaning better under our side. But secondly, we explain that religions are able to provide a better sense of fulfillment. For instance, things like sense of certainty, guidance on ethics and moral principles that are able to provide you with how to live life better. Or for instance, a sense of purpose that you ought to live a better dream and better goal than they say. Let's respond to their characterization. The only characterization we get as to why individuals still have some amount of choice for self-actualization is minimal. What they say is that they could also create sense of community and they could create communities based on hobbies. The first thing I'd like to respond is that deeply religious people obviously can continue to have hobbies. We don't get the exclusivity of their analysis under their side. But comparatively, what is exclusive is that individuals under our side are given certain forms of beliefs, certain forms of self-actualization and means of actualization that will continue to be the most important. Even if individuals gain doubts, for instance, in our worst case, where individuals start to question religions, there are other reaffirming factors that make you believe this is the most important thing in your life. For instance, the fact that the people around you tell you that you could reach heaven and self-actualization better is actually good, because people feel fulfilled to reaffirm our beliefs under our side. The conclusion to this clash is simple. The first thing you ought to know is that their means of self-actualization are actually non-exclusive. What is exclusive is the certainty and unconditionality that continues to make you feel like you could self-actualize better under our side. I'll take that.
Why do you need religions to guide you?
Religions, we explained that status quo is a world where lots of people are faced with indifferences and people cannot engage to the fullest. Second clash on why we minimize suffering better. Their biggest push is that when you're born as a minority within religions, people are going to suffer. Why do religions minimize the suffering of vulnerable individuals? The first thing we explained is that religions are more likely to be collective than secular societies where there are hyper-individualistic norms. This means that collective mindsets necessitates the inclusion of minorities because it is the religious deity's interest to include the very individuals that came to presence because of God's meaning. I.e., disabled people must be continued to included due to communal obligation that exists under our side. Secondly, capitalistic metrics are structurally discriminatory of minorities. Example, capitalistic success is cutthroat. You either do make money, you do not, or it's zero sum. There's limited amounts of seats available for you to climb the top. But thirdly, there's less discrimination under our world due to things like diverse interpretations. The only response we get from DLO on why there are diverse interpretations for minorities to be self-actualized is that this is a minority case. Judge, this debate is about minorities too. Like, they cannot respond to our argument by saying this is a minority case. Even if it is a minority case, we got to engage with this metric because it is the very metric to which individuals are able to, like, the intensity of the impact is the most important. But lastly, the conclusion you ought to get from this response is that there's more likelihood of less autonomy in secular societies. Why is this the case? Number one, within secular societies, the capitalistic structures are less flexible compared to religious societies. But secondly, even if not flexible, religions are the very structures that are able to include you unconditionally. They have communal obligations to want to make minorities feel like these are important entities that continue to exist. At the end of my speech, you ought to note two things. Number one, maximizing self-actualization is the most important because it is the most universal and in terms of scale, the most important clash. But number two, even in minorities, we explain why minorities are better off under our world.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and I welcome the opposition whip.
Sorry, before I start, I want to do a couple thank yous. Firstly, thank you to my amazing teammates, Ayan and Nayun. I really couldn't be here without you guys. Also, thank you to our opponents for the so far great and amazing debate. And also, I'm looking forward to being on the same team as you guys instead of debating on you like I am on stage right now. And finally, thank you to our amazing coaches who have helped me throughout my entire debate career. Sally, Jan, Wonbin, and Alex were sitting in the back, as well as all of the other coaches who have helped me get to where I am today. With that, my speech begins on my first word. I will never judge a person for wanting to become better. In fact, if you look all around you, the prevailing narrative in societies, in families, in communities, in social media is to become a better person through any means necessary. This is why health and beauty influencers are so popular in the modern day. This is why influencers like Andrew Tate or people that tell you how to become better have become so popularized. The inverse, and what this debate is about, comparison, is true. Religion exists because they have chosen to differentiate themselves from the rest of society through divine punishment. Therefore, this debate isn't about the benefits of being a good person versus an excellent person or a very good person. This debate is about how we avoid the most extreme, most damaging harms that come from the incentive structure of religious institutions. First clash then, what is the correct characterization of this debate? I have two sub-points here. Firstly, what exactly does this motion mean? This motion does not immediately mean that everyone will live the most healthy version of a certain religion with healthy communities. This debate is not actually about the average actor. It calls for all of us who are sitting on the stage to analyze all types of actors and determine which are the most important and relevant in this debate. The harm that Nayun solidly proves to you and that Ayn continues out through our bench doesn't disappear just because they say, oh, you don't want it to happen. Of course you guys don't want it to happen. That's why I need responses. But it's a debate losing strategic choice to not engage with the largest harm that is proven throughout this debate. Second subpoint then, what do religious institutions actually look like? Obviously, it is impossible to perfectly generalize religion in one sentence. I'm not going to try to do that to you guys today. The implication of this actually is that characterizations can coexist. Religious people can be bigoted and exclusive towards certain minorities, and they can preach love thy neighbor. Evangelicals in the US can be closely related to conservatism and MAGA movement, and some churches can value charity. All of these characterizations can exist in this debate. Therefore, we tell you that here, on the principle of vulnerability, it is more important to prevent these harms than to create these benefits, because the people that we care about in debate land are people that are suffering more rather than those who are already doing well. Second clash then, why is it that religion has become less and less important throughout society? Because I don't think they ever give you the answer. Religion became less prevalent in then 200 or 100 or even 300 years ago. This is because the unique benefits of religion have become accessible through other means, which means the benefits are no longer exclusive. Specifically through this debate, what are relevant are the two following points. Firstly, the majority of prop case, in fact, the vast majority of their first speech is about having communities and forming a sense of belonging. Two responses. Firstly, we tell you that there are viable alternatives that we have proven that have lesser likelihood to be abusive or exploitative in status quo. Proposition does never tell us why their benefit is exclusive or marginally better than what we can access on our world. But secondly, even if we buy to some extent that a community-based or religious beliefs are more genuine or more connected or more likely to help you when you're falling out, the analysis that is lacking from proposition is why this incremental benefit or this incremental change is the tipping point to access all of the benefits that they say they will. In fact, we tell you that this analysis is quite uncomparative to the existence of reality. If the question is, who is more likely to lend you $10 when I am broke, my family or my church friends, I think the answer is quite clear. Second subpoint then. Secondly, on morality, government tells you that it is difficult to form a new view of what is right and wrong. This is untrue for a couple of reasons. Firstly, being kind to others, respecting diverse opinions, and have become more prevalent through the rise of different narratives and social movements, which is exactly what Ayn tells you in her extension and is never responded to, i.e. feminism or wokeism means that there are social consequences of not being a bad person. Secondly, there is a wide access of information not only about religious beliefs, but different philosophies or different types of moral systems that can shape your knowledge of ethics. This means that if you value belief systems, then it's easy and accessible to find. Notice how we respond to Jacob's push that the opt-in to morality is extremely high. Even if I am not particularly interested in philosophic theories, I accumulate enough knowledge throughout my life not to become a thief or a murderer. In this debate, avoiding this harm is quite enough. Then, what is actually the most important issue of this round? What is debate winning? What is the weighing? My teammates have provided to you so many characterizations and analysis as to why in proposition world there exists a possibility to clash with the majority religion, whether that is because you're born into a minority religion, or whether it is because you have trauma, or basically whether that is because your innate characterizations like your sexual orientation do not collaborate with the religion. All of these possibilities are not what the motion controls. The motion controls what community you are born into. It does not control what you believe, your identity, for example, your race or sexuality, and the experiences that you have in a religious institution. Then, why are the harms of religion uniquely detrimental in this round? Firstly, the degree of magnitude is so great that it overrides all likelihood analysis that can even come from their bench. Being indoctrinated into a cult, losing your autonomy, being forced to hide your identity forever, being systematically abused by the powerful, these are all harms that will impact you forever. I don't think any of us, or most of us in this room, can comprehend the mental harm of being told time and time again, day after day, that you are going to be sent to hell if you don't join our religion, or being sexually abused by a pastor. No matter how much instances happen, they are the greatest harm in this debate, and they are impossible to ignore. On exclusivity, secondly, because of the structural incentives of religion, we are able to explain to you down the bench, religious institutions have an incentive to exclude and otherize people who are not part of the religion. The inverse of this does not exist in society structurally, and they have not given you analysis to prove why it does. But thirdly and comparatively, we weigh over the benefits of religion because the amount of positive benefit it provides in your life is rather more incremental and non-exclusive in the contemporary world. In comparative weighing, therefore, we win in terms of magnitude and exclusivity as well as vulnerability, like I've told you before. What I mean is that no one on proposition tells me how the benefits of having a solid view of morality significantly improves my quality of life as an individual. And quite frankly, it's very late to do that, as our next speaker will be reply. Very proud to be on opposition.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and I now welcome the opposition reply.
The fear of going to hell far outweighs the fear of having less people around me who share fairly similar interests. Although we proved why interests, hobbies, things that bring people together is pretty fair and exists on our side to a similar extent, what matters more is the fear that a dominantly religious community imposes on you when you choose to follow something different simply because you were born into a family that doesn't agree, or because you, as an adult individual, do not agree with what the religion tells you. Till the end of this debate, very proud to oppose. Here's how I'm going to structure my speech. I'm going to talk about what the main metric to winning this debate was, how each side tried to take that, and then ultimately, which team wins this debate. The main metric was pretty clear from the start. We told you it should be about the autonomy of people to choose their own religions. Then starting with prop, I think over the autonomy to choose religion, prop actually wants a world where people have religious fulfillment, and they tell you things like you feel more comforted when you know that there is a God looking down on, looking over you, and supposedly there is still autonomy on their side because religions are so inclusive. A few ways we took this down throughout the bench. Firstly, not all religious communities have inclusive scriptures, which determines the way that people in that community view you, especially if you're a minority. Some religions, for instance, outright condemn being queer, and under the veil of ignorance, you're not going to know that you're queer. So if you're born as a minority to such a community that will never accept you simply because scripture bans such things, and religious people usually don't go against what scripture tells them, these harms are far outweigh whatever happens on their side, and that was made pretty clear from the start of our team. But second, their idea of fulfillment coming from full and majority belief in a forgiving and loving God can, yes, be comforting for some, but burdening to others, because obviously it all depends on how your worldview, or how you just want to view the world based on what that religion tells you. Because you were indoctrinated by a religious family, you feel that every bad thing is planned by God. But for some, that pressures them to wonder why they were entitled to such bad things, and wondering why God forces them to be in such terrible positions. And that was a very crucial rebuttal that our deputy gave you in her speech. But thirdly, based on all this, it's made quite obvious that religious autonomy is valuable and therefore an appropriate metric to winning this debate. Then how do we prove why we win autonomy? And we told you that autonomy is totally accepted when you live in secular community. Because Because firstly, secular people generally don't care about sharing the beliefs of atheism because that's not like religions, which inherently try to pull you in no matter what. Even if you are a minority, they're always going to find ways to change your mind, to be like, I know you had this trauma, I know you had that experience, but perhaps consider being forgiven, perhaps consider choosing this religion. That's the way religious community works, especially in a community where almost everybody else is religious. That's just so coercive. Few ways that Prop tried to take down our way to winning this debate. First, they say that secularism makes these communities capitalist, which was just like DLO told you that religious communities likely have similar values of having competition anyways. It's not like because you live in a community where everybody believes in the same faith, there's no such competition or no such focus on like being rich or being successful economically or whatever. Religion and such competition are not necessarily contingent on each other. But second, they say that being surrounded by secular people make you individualistic. It is unclear why having no religion, and by the way, there are still some believers on our side of the house too because it's predominantly secular. Just because you're religious in this world doesn't mean you're the only one out there, means that you're a lot more selfish. We told you that if religion isn't the bonding factor, then other things will clearly be, and people will find other ways to bond with each other. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech, and to end this grand finals, I welcome the government reply.
Can I start? The problem with opposition is that if they want to prove minorities become disenfranchised in religious societies, they also need to prove to you that this is frequent enough to affect the veil of ignorance. Because this debate takes place under the veil of ignorance, and we think in every veil of ignorance situations, there exists risks. Like in opposition's world, we told you that there exists symmetric, if not even higher probabilities. You are born as an economic minority, you are born as a racial minority. There are in fact different types of minorities and higher chances you are born as minorities under opposition. The strategic implication is that their main form of weighing and their main form of argumentation is contingent on our absolute worst case, but I will prove why this is something we are still willing to defend and why it is still a clear proposition win. Let's first talk about the issue of fulfillment and optionality. They give you this weighing very late at opposition whip on why vulnerability is an important metric in this debate. This is ineffective for a few structural reasons. First, let's weigh the worst cases of both scenarios. We think this is going to be a wash in many worst case scenarios because we think if you are born as a minority under opposition, the same kinds of harms they talk about exactly apply. They are never able to distinguish why the probability is different and why the degree to harm is different. We told you that the probability is actually higher on opposition. Second, minorities are better off in our world. We give you a number of structural reasons. Notice, opposition whip's weighing is contingent on the fact that actually being born as a minority itself in a lot of these religious societies is inherently bad. But we deny this premise from the get-go, and this is something they never respond to, which is why the degree to which you can buy opposition whip's weighing is questionable. First, capitalism is designed against minorities. Religion is not. For example, the purpose of capitalism is to gain money. It is to create inequality. This is why inequality is rampant in capitalism. We told you more minorities actually exist in their counterfactual. Second, we told you minorities are better in a world where we think religious texts and religious interpretations often value things like equal communitarian respect. First, they never give you an accurate depiction of what these minorities look like in our world. They never give you illustrations of how they are actually harmed. They give you vague analysis. But second, we told you that in most instances, we told you minorities' roles are still respected within these societies because these societies are often, not as capitalistic. They're not as large, which often means that every role's contribution matters significantly more. But I want to end my speech by talking about opposition's world, and I will explain to you why this is probably round determining. Even if all of the issues above are a wash or a deadlock, we think the opposition needed to defend their positive case in this debate, which is they need to explain why indecision crisis is not a thing. They need to explain why the practical means of fulfillment is accessible in their world, but this is something they never do. They never respond to our argument and characterization that people in the status quo actually care more about what? Things like practicalities, which is why they are likely to procrastinate in in joining these groups and engaging in self-fulfillment. Only when you are born in an environment where you are told to engage in these means of fulfillment can you elevate yourself to higher than superficial practicalities. This is something they never responded to. The implication is that if you draw a comparison of both worlds, opposition's world is murkier than ours. It is unclear, it is still harmful for minorities, it still disenfranchises the most vulnerable, and it also harms the average individuals in society.
I thank the previous speaker for that speech. That concludes the grand finals. Can we get another round of applause for our two grand finalists? The judges will now deliberate, but before that, can each team send one representative to inform us about your vetoes?